Hello and welcome to the TID Water and Power Podcast. I'm your host, Constance Anderson, and on this month's episode, we're discussing groundwater recharge projects. The 2022-2023 water year was the third wettest on record, and thanks to quick action and innovative solutions, TID was able to pilot several groundwater recharge projects using that floodwater. However, with ever-changing hydrological conditions and the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, or SGMA, the district will need to continue to innovate and implement new recharge projects. On this episode, I'm joined by TID Supervising Engineering Technician Wes Miller to discuss the district's relationship with groundwater, projects we were able to pilot last year, and what types of recharge projects are coming down the pipe. Pun intended. Wes, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Constance.
All right. So, Wes, let's start, as we traditionally do, with you telling us a little bit about your background with the district.
Okay. Well, I've been at TID now going on close to 29 years. Started in 1995 as a utility worker out of the warehouse. Did that for about a year and a half. But basically, it was a mail runner. I was delivering packages and mail throughout the district. At that time, Steve Boyd was the operations manager over in the water distribution department. There was an opening within the area for a ditch tender, WDO. He thought that maybe I would be a good fit for that position. So I put in for that position, got the job, and did it for about 10 years. So after that, 10 years of being a ditch tender or water distribution operator, I put in and became the water operations manager around 2007. And then did that for about 4 years before being promoted to engineering tech in about 2011, where I was taking care of the assessments, like the ID assessments, pipeline assessments that happen every year for our customers. So after about a year of doing the assessments in that new tech position that I was in, there was a need to fill a project manager role for our SBX 7-7 project, which those of you who are out there that are familiar, you see a lot of the Rubicons or the water measurement at the side gates. That was the SBX 7-7 project. And so I took that on around 2012. That project is still happening today. It's just now it's in implementation phase. It's not in the construction phase or the capital phase. So now we're moving through with implementation. Around 2022 or so, I started actually working on developing a groundwater recharge pilot project within TID. It was part of our strategic plan. It was an action task in the strategic plan for us to do that in the end of 2022. And so since I had some operational experience on the irrigation system, it just made sense for me to try to push that forward to start doing recharge in the district. So we did. We started in the winter of 2022.
So the timing really couldn't have been better as far as you becoming kind of the manager over this groundwater recharge project that was in the strategic plan and what was to come in the 2022-2023 water year.
Right. Yeah. It all just worked out. The timing of it with the water year. I mean, really, it could have been maybe years before being able to do any kind of recharge. We were just coming off of a drought. Multi-year drought. And so it just worked out. Perfect.
Before we dive into the potential projects, I think it's important for listeners to understand the district's relationship with groundwater. Can you explain that for us?
Yeah. So TID has been utilizing or using conjunctive use for decades, where we're talking about using surface water and groundwater both. In years where there's enough surface water, we try to deliver as much surface water from the Tuolumne as possible to not impact the groundwater. That way, in drier years in the future, we can call on a portion of that water that's in the groundwater storage that we've been put it in to supplement the surface water deliveries to help get us through drought. Typically, on average, the TID is a net recharger of groundwater in our subbasin. So the Turlock subbasin is made up of two GSAs, East Turlock and West Turlock. West Turlock, roughly 85% of our water that we deliver, on average, is surface water, meaning that water is coming from Tuolumne River. On the other hand, the majority of the water on the east side is groundwater. So they do have a small portfolio of surface water they have at their disposal. The majority is going to be groundwater. So we're net rechargers on the West Turlock side of approximately 100,000 acre feet a year. So we're putting in much more than we're taking out. That's on average.
So thanks to our access to reliable surface water, that has allowed TID to maintain a more sustainable subbasin than much of the Central Valley around us. Can you kind of explain how the state sees the current condition of our subbasin as compared to some of the other subbasins in the state?
So yes, our access over the many years of having surface water, dependable surface water, has put us in a position to where we aren't considered critically overdrafted. The Turlock subbasin is a high priority basin as far as what the state is considered under SGMA, but we are in a much better position here as opposed to other areas of the San Joaquin Valley, which has really been impacted significantly by overdraft.
And how does that groundwater play into a gravity-based system like the one that TID operates? We're like you said, we're typically pulling most of our irrigation water as surface water from the Tuolumne River, and it all flows by gravity through the system. Where does groundwater come into that?
So typically, in years where there is high demand, there are capacity constraints within our irrigation system. We have a great system. That being said, there's a lot of acres connected to that system. And so in order to meet that demand in a timely fashion, we try to get people within 72 hours of placing a water order. Having groundwater available to meet that demand in a timely fashion helps. So that's where the pumps come into play, because the pumps lower in the system are much closer to that demand. So if you're just delivering water from the lake or from Tuolumne River, those are 24-hour blocks of water that it takes to get the water down to the customer. And that could really push you up pretty far on wait times for customers. So it helps to meet that demand and not have customers wait so long and potentially having any kind of crop damage. And that being said, the fact that water is closer to the demand, it actually helps us spill less. So we're able to control it closer to the demand. So when a farmer's done, we can turn it off at a pump, as opposed to having to go all the way to Turlock Lake, make the change, and having that change cascade throughout the system. It's much quicker and easier to control that water with a pump that's closer to the demand, if that makes sense.
So if the district has managed our groundwater basin so well, why are we exploring new recharge projects?
So like I said earlier, TID, we are net rechargers in the West Turlock GSA. But as a basin, as a whole, we are in a deficit because of that pumping that happens in East Turlock, being so reliant on groundwater. So we're roughly on average in the area of 80,000 acre foot in overdraft between both sides combined together with our recharge and their overpumping. And so there is a need. We are still as far as SGMA is concerned, we are still a high priority basin because of that overdraft. So there is a need to do recharge here to help the sub-basin as a whole.
What are some of the other reasons why it's important for us to consider some of these new recharge projects?
Well, over time, things just like everything else change, and people get better at doing what they do. When flood irrigation first started in the early 1900s in TID, the ground wasn't set up great. It didn't flood very well. The whole thought of being efficient, that just kind of wasn't there. So a lot of people over irrigated and over applied water. And so the groundwater came up actually too high in a lot of places. Well, we got better, right? The farmers got better at doing things more efficiently on farm. We got better at delivering water on a schedule that they could use. And they did the same thing on their side where the farmers got more efficient as far as a lot of them switched from flood irrigation to micro drip pressurized systems, to help save water and be more efficient. So the ground that has made that change to more efficient irrigation and less flooding, well, that also has implications on groundwater because now there's not as much going to groundwater as like it did in the past. And those places that have made the most changes of switching to micro drip or pressurized systems is in the area that's most heavily influenced by the groundwater pumping that's happening to the east. Right. And so there's still a need. People have gotten better. We've gotten better. At the same time, that has impacted groundwater.
Sure. That makes sense. I would have to guess that the changing hydrological conditions have also kind of played a role here?
Yeah, so the swings, the droughts and the wet years, things are changing with climate change. Obviously, we're seeing wetter wet years and drier dry years, and so that's contributing as well. That's why it's really important now more than ever when we have these wet scenarios is to get that water in the ground, because we know the dry years, are going to be drier.
Okay, so as you mentioned, we're looking at this not just from a TID perspective, but as the subbasin as a whole. So can you kind of paint a picture for us as to what we're talking about when we reference our subbasin? There's an east and a west, but what does that look like?
So when you're talking about the subbasin, to the north, the boundary would be, generally speaking, the Tuolumne River. To the west, generally speaking, it would be the San Joaquin River. There are going to be some grounds close to those rivers that are out, technically, of TID's irrigation boundary, but they are still considered West Turlock. To the south, it's going to be the Merced River, generally speaking. And then to the east, it's going to be, there's a foothill area east of TID that would be considered the boundary between the Turlock subbasin and then a foothill area.
So that was kind of then the boundary that was used when putting together the groundwater sustainability plan for RGSA.
Correct. And so the West Turlock, generally speaking, if you're just trying to visualize what west and east, the north-south or east-west, boundary, if you can picture where Hickman Road is, just east of us, generally speaking, ground to the east of Hickman Road is probably included in that East Turlock GSA. Generally speaking,
Sure.
It goes in and out both ways, but that's kind of the line between East and West Turlock. And within that, so we'll go within the West Turlock area. So now we're talking about Hickman Road all the way to the San Joaquin River. There are areas that are generally better to do recharge activities in, and there's areas where you should not probably do recharge in. So we've identified through some previous studies, groundwater recharge studies with consultants and using some USDA data, that generally speaking, Highway 99 is kind of that line, that splits our area of more beneficial and less beneficial. So it doesn't mean that you wouldn't do recharge in areas that's less beneficial. You wouldn't want to focus a lot of water, in those areas. There's still domestic well owners in those areas that you might perceive as bad areas for recharge, but some recharge could be beneficial just because of domestic well owners, disadvantaged communities. So that would be 99 West, generally speaking. And then when you go 99 East, those are the areas that are where recharge would be most beneficial, right? Because that area has been mostly impacted by that cone of depression, where the cone of depression that's happened on the east side is the groundwater draw is so heavy on the east because of all the pumping that it's pulling the groundwater east, where naturally that water would have went east to west towards the rivers. Now the pumping draw is so heavy on the east side in East Turlock that it's pulling the groundwater backwards.
Oh, wow.
So it's lowering those levels for domestic well owners and ag wells, disadvantaged communities. In that eastern portion of the West Turlock, there's a lot of east and west. I know it's confusing, but if you're thinking about the eastern portion of the West Turlock subbasin, you're talking about like Houston, you're talking about Denair, you're talking about East Turlock, you're talking about Vallejo, Delhi. Those are kind of the areas we're talking about that are impacted negatively by this cone of depression.
Got it.
So generally speaking, you're going to want to focus more recharge in those areas, if that makes sense.
Okay. And so then moving from that area back to the west, what are some of the characteristics of that territory that would make it a better or maybe less desirable place for recharge?
The further west you go of that line, the groundwater comes up dramatically. There are some areas in our district in that area that are the groundwater's almost to the surface, 4, 5, 2, 1 foot below the ground surface.
Wow.
There's restrictive layers, the Corcoran clay. It's a ancient restrictive layer put in place by what's known as Corcoran Lake, where the valley used to be a lake, prehistoric times. and there is a deposit of clay in that area that has formed a restrictive layer, right? So flood irrigating, precipitation over time, there's this restrictive layer that keeps it from going to deep water. So it just kind of mounds on that restrictive layer. And so...
And thus sets closer to the surface then.
Correct.
Okay.
And so it doesn't make sense to do recharge in those areas that has that condition going on.
What would some of the negative implications be of doing recharge in those areas?
So these are areas where people still have septic systems, right? It's out in the country. So, things as simple as flushing your toilet, taking a shower, their basements. People have basements, root cellars in those areas. It will impact them negatively. We still have areas today that, we had this condition we talked about where we had this huge draw going to the east. We still have areas in the west side of us that people still can't flush their toilets. They can't take showers without standing in water.
Because that groundwater level is so high.
Correct.
Wow.
So that necessitates the need for us to do drainage pumping. We have TID drainage pumps that were put in the 1920s because of all that flood irrigating and the groundwater was coming up. That was the only way to keep everything from turning into a swamp.
Wow.
Was to pump that water out. And it still happens in areas in TID today.
I was going to say, because I would have to imagine then that that water level would impact crops in that area.
Correct. Yeah, there's been a lot of land that was not planted in trees or permanent crops back in the day that now are, because the water levels have dropped enough to make that possible so the trees or permanent crops don't drown.
Okay.
Even when flood irrigation first started, that groundwater coming up was kind of deemed was a benefit because of all the melons and things that were being farmed back in the day. They actually called it sub-irrigation, where they didn't have to irrigate because it was being irrigated from the high groundwater.
Wow. That's a whole different type of irrigation.
Permanent crops do not like that situation.
But as you mentioned, so we have pumps in that area that were put in, what did you say, back in the 20s?
Correct.
That, as you mentioned earlier, irrigation was much more inefficient when we first started this process back at the founding of TID. But those pumps still serve us well today, even with more efficient irrigation, just in a little bit different capacity.
Correct. Yeah, the area needing to be pumped has been reduced. Right. We have TID drainage pumps that are in Houston, Denair, and Turlock that aren't needed for that today. Mm-hmm. But who knows what the future holds with more recharge and maybe less demand on the groundwater. You never know. Some of those pumps that haven't been run for those reasons might need to be ran for that purpose again in the future. So we still have those.
Okay. So as I mentioned when I was introducing today's episode, we're coming off the third wettest year on record, which was a year in which the district piloted several recharge projects. How did these projects come to be last year?
So as I mentioned earlier, one of the action tasks in our strategic plan was to implement a groundwater recharge pilot project in TID in 2022. As things played out, the weather, it was becoming more obvious than ever that there was going to be water available to do some sort of recharge. Sustainable Conservation is a nonprofit that was contracted by California DWR to pilot 6 recharge locations, floodmar recharge locations within the Sacramento and San Joaquin valleys. They were looking for partners. It's my understanding that they were having a hard time getting districts to agree to work with them on this. It just worked out. They reached out to us early in 2022. The hydrology was making it look like it could happen in TID. So 3 of those sites of the 6 that I mentioned were actually within TID. DWR was looking to create a framework to expand floodmar statewide. So the intent was to use the data, real examples between irrigation districts and farmers on what the challenges and wins were with performing floodmar in the wintertime.
Okay, I'm going to stop you there for a second, and I'm going to ask you, so DWR, Department of Water Resources, so they were partnering with Sustainable Conservation, and then Sustainable Conservation, they were actually the ones that reached out to TID. Is that right?
Yeah, they contracted. So DWR contracted Sustainable Conservation.
Okay.
So Sustainable Conservation reached out to us. So DWR didn't reach out to us. Sustainable Conservation did because they were contracted by DWR.
Okay. And then you mentioned FloodMAR. So when you say FloodMAR, what does that mean?
So FloodMAR means Flood Managed Aquifer Recharge, or MAR, right? So the concept is to use floodwaters that could otherwise be damaging flows to downstream facilities in the river system, whether it be the San Joaquin, Sacramento, or Delta, is to be able to harness those flood flows, put it on land where possible, and recharge the groundwater. So you're mitigating the flood risk downstream on the river system while also propping up groundwater supplies or storage in areas that could really use it.
Okay.
So for a future beneficial use.
Okay. And I think that's an important distinction to make because we're not using water out of Don Pedro to do this. We're using winter storm runoff water. Is that correct?
Correct. We're not talking about stored water. We're talking about pre-flood releases on the Tuolumne River. We're talking about local flood flows that are coming from local flood control facilities, whether it be county, city, or dedicated flood control facilities that are trying to get water off of lands immediately in our immediate area. So that's the water we're talking about.
Okay. And like you said, at this point, we were able to anticipate that there was more wet weather coming, that we had some significant atmospheric rivers that were going to come through. What would that, if we didn't have these recharge projects in place, what would that have meant for the local ground that had already seen so much rainfall?
So in the grand scheme of things, when you're in a flood situation, it's not just here. The river system all over is in this flood situation. And from DWR's perspective, every molecule of water that you can get off the river system in a flood situation is a benefit because it all adds up to a bigger number in the end. So that being said, the numbers that we delivered last year in our pilots, it wasn't a big number, to be completely honest. We were trying to do kind of a proof of concept that it would work here and what it would take. So like I said, the grand scheme, we delivered a little over 80 acre feet of water. Not a ton. But when everybody is doing a little bit at a time, it adds up to a lot.
Sure, absolutely.
So locally, it wasn't like we were saving the world by delivering 80 acre feet of water. But we were trying to prove that we could do it to try to scale it up in the future to make a bigger impact.
I was going to say, because you have the tactical moving of that stormwater out of the system, but then you also have the learning that comes from that. And it sounds like maybe that's a big part of what DWR was after, is kind of the data and the learning and the how do we actually make this happen in the future? Right.
They were looking on the farmer side specifically. There's a lot of questions out there about what am I doing to my crop when I'm putting water on it in the wintertime when I'm not supposed to put water on it, especially during the middle of a storm scenario. We were delivering water during these pilots during these atmospheric river events, right? So you're talking about inches of rain. You're talking about strong winds. Typically, if you're a tree grower, you're not putting water on at that time.
Bad combination.
It scares you to death to think about putting water on your crop. And so that's what they wanted to learn. They wanted to be able to document the impacts. What were the costs that our growers saw to do this? Was there trees that blew over? What was there salt issues? What did they run into?
Mm-hmm. And so what kind of was the initial outlook from our growers? Did they, they're seeing this water in the canals. Did they think that this was a good idea? Were they reluctant to it?
So the growers that actually did partner with us, they were forward thinkers. They are on stormwater routes where they would see the water going by the canal, by their ranch. They recognize the benefit of recharge. Some of them, actually all of them, grow in other areas, not within our GSA. So they kind of knew what other areas were going through for recharge. And so it seemed kind of wasteful to see that water going by. So it just worked out with the way the weather and the forecast and the snowpack and the river system was so impacted. Growers that were calling me willing to participate. It just worked out.
Okay, so then let's get into some of the specifics of these projects from the winter 2022-23 season a bit. We were implementing these pilots as early as December, I think, if I remember correctly, despite it still being pretty early in the water year. How did these projects come together so quickly?
So location was key with these pilot spots. They were immediately downstream of where local flood flows enter our canal system. We didn't have to go through a lot of effort to try to move that water in different parts of the system. It was already there naturally through these flood facilities. It was just coming into our system. So that worked out. There's automation also that's really been helpful at the head of these canals and at some of these drop structures where we have to back the water up to deliver it to the customers. Automation was already in place. So when you're talking about delivering local storm flows, it can be dangerous because just the nature of these flows, it's very flashy. The water is running off of ground very quickly. You get branches and trees and leaves and tumbleweeds. Usually the wind's blowing, all that stuff. Anybody seen our canal system in the wintertime when the wind blows, it's full of tumbleweeds. So it's very hard to safely deliver water through a gravity system. Gravity system means the water has to be high in the canal. The level has to be high enough to push it by gravity onto the land around it. And so when you have debris in your system that's plugging up our system, it makes it dangerous. So typically what we would do is we would lower our canal system down, run it on what we call the floor. We'd run it on the bottom to get that stuff out as quick as possible to mitigate any flood risk. So where these were at, these locations, with the automation, we were able to more safely do that.
Okay. All right. So you mentioned that there was about 82 acre feet total water that was irrigated through as part of these floodmar projects. Let's talk about each of the 3 sites, if you would.
Sure. Okay. So there were just under 68 acres total that applied water, floodmar water through this pilot. 2 of the locations were in Balico. The Balico area is impacted heavily by this cone of depression I mentioned earlier, that overpumping draw from the east. So they've seen the biggest impact. Within TID, they haven't seen the biggest impact, but they have been impacted. So Houston's had the same issue. Denair had the same issue as well. These were established almond orchards, ranging anywhere from 4 years in age all the way up to 29 years in age. So it was a wide range of crops. But again, these were almond orchards. The other orchard was in the West Turlock Series area. It's just west of 99. Again, established trees anywhere from 4 years old up to over 20 years old. These customers, again, were seeing the water go by their place. They recognize the benefit of recharge. They had existing flood facilities still on their ranches, where a lot of other places within the state, a lot of farmers have removed their flood facilities because they made that switch to drip micro or pressurized deliveries. So they just wanted to get those flood facilities out of their way. It was an inconvenience to have them still on their property. Fast forward to where we are today, and all of them regret removing those facilities because now they have no way to convey these flood flows for recharge onto their property without installing new or temporary facilities to make it happen. So like I said, we're still blessed here with most of our flood facilities privately owned are still intact, right? So the ground's already been set up to flood irrigate. Other parts of the state, the ground wasn't set up to flood. It was set up to drip.
Sure.
Right. And so they didn't have to level it and set the slopes to flood irrigate. It just works here.
Yeah, I guess that's another part of just kind of the whole thing coming together in the right place at the right time. These growers who were interested in the recharge projects still had the capability and the infrastructure to actually participate.
Correct. They were older facilities, but they were still able to convey water safely. They didn't have to install anything.
How were the locations that participated in these floodmar projects, how were they selected?
Well, again, they're downstream of where local floodwater enters our system. For example, the West Turlock Series location irrigates from Upper Lateral 3. And if you're familiar with our area, Upper Lateral 3 runs along Taylor Road, just north of Turlock. It's a canal right there on the north side of Turlock. That is the first place where stormwater enters our system. That's the first lateral that water gets conveyed through. So it just worked out. Again, where this customer was at on the Balico properties, they are on the Highline Canal. Okay, so the High Line also has local runoff that runs in from the lands to the east of TID. And so it just, again, it keeps saying it and beating this drum, but it just worked out where these people were located. It was an easy decision to pull the trigger on where to put the water because I didn't have to move it all throughout the system and all these things, these challenges we talked about with stormwater. I could focus on 2 areas alone.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so in participating in these floodmar projects, did they just take water onto their fields once? Was this a recurring thing? How often was the water actually brought onto their properties?
So the how often question was answered by them. Didn't want to impose or try to sway them to do it. We wanted them to make the decision to be a willing partner to do it, right? So one of the locations in Belica was only able to put water on twice. It's just the way the operations worked out for them. You know, they had staff. It was around the holiday time. They were all out of town. They weren't anticipating the need to do this, right?
Sure.
They had vacations scheduled, and so they were only able to get the water on 2 times. Another one, the other Belico site, irrigated 5 times. Sometimes they would finish the field and start right back over.
Oh, wow.
They would go nonstop. And this is during active AR or atmospheric river events. We had already received inches of rain. It was raining at the time they were flood irrigating. So they were able to do it 5 times. And then the the Ceres, West Turlock location, same thing. They irrigated 5 times during active heavy rainfall, heavy winds. So
these growers were really kind of taking a chance on this.
They were taking a chance. They were getting some comments from neighbors going, "What are you thinking?"
It's not typical, that's for sure.
Yeah. Why are you flood irrigating in the rain? What are you thinking? Your trees are all going to blow over. You're going to do X, Y, and Z to your crop. But like I said, these growers had a little more exposure to other areas, right? And so they kind of knew. They didn't go into it blindly. There was some risk involved with what they were doing. We have sandier grounds here in TID than maybe some other areas. And so there was kind of some thought of we're going to lose some trees. As a result of this flooding, this floodmar, none of these growers saw a change in trees blowing over. They didn't lose any more trees because of it than they did on other orchards. It worked out. But they were getting the side eye from neighbors for a little while.
All right. So you mentioned that they didn't see a significant change in the number of trees that blew over or some of the maybe more immediate repercussions. What was some of the data that we gathered from these programs as far as what was our learning? What did we see?
So we have put significant effort into side gate measurement, where we put in the Rubicons at the side gates to comply with the Water Conservation Act of 2009. That was a regulatory requirement. And so we already had the water measurement in place that I was able to leverage that equipment to be able to measure these deliveries. That was one of the requirements of the project, was to be able to quantify recharge. Well, without knowing how much water you're applying, it's kind of a guess. So we were able to use that equipment to measure those deliveries and quantify actually how much was applied. Other districts, when I talk to Sustainable Conservation, because they're working with multiple districts, right, and multiple people.
Sure.
They considered our system and the way we measure water to be Cadillac in their mind compared to what they've seen in other places. So they were very impressed. And again, it was a requirement of the project, so it just worked out. I mentioned earlier it was about 81 acre feet. Again, we're not talking huge numbers. We're talking about proof of concept here. It would have been 81 acre feet that would have been in the river system that was actually currently flooding. Mm-hmm. So there was a benefit. Mm-hmm. Something else, as far as what we found out, was on the grower side. There was a cost. They did have to put in their own time. They had to use their own equipment to pull levees in some cases. Generally speaking, they saw anywhere from $1,200 to $1,400 cost on their side to participate. In other areas of the state, the cost was significantly higher for people that were trying to participate in flood more. Like I mentioned earlier, they didn't have facilities in place because they ripped them out. So they had to rent temporary pumps, which in a flood, good luck trying to find a pump to rent.
Good point.
So the availability of these pumping plants, these mobile pumping plants, it just wasn't there. And it's very expensive to do that. Not to mention having to put in temporary piping to do this. So while $1,200 to $1,400 sounds like a lot of money, when you compare it to other areas of the state, it is significantly less than other places as far as the grower's cost. Something else that we got out of this, or we learned from this, was the scheduling of off-season canal maintenance and projects. Typically in the wintertime, we drain our system to do required maintenance, whether it be cleaning or patching, capital projects, what have you. Those things have to happen regardless every year. We have to keep the system running. So deferring that maintenance or these projects to a different year just isn't feasible at the expense of the entire system. So it created a situation where we had to think about maintenance schedules differently, where it was no water can go in the system from November to March. Now it's trigger these internal conversations within TID, within departments to say, okay, where do we prioritize this work to be able to leverage storm flows or flood flows in the future for recharge? So how do we free the system up in a way where we can still get maintenance done and still do recharge at the same time?
Because there's always going to be some kind of a trade-off, right? When there are multiple demands on the system, there has to be some kind of compromise as far as if we're going to participate in these recharge programs, it means we're pushing our maintenance to another time, but the maintenance still has to get done. So when does that happen? Yeah.
So the farther up the system you go, and let's say upstream, closer to Turlock Lake, those will probably need to be prioritized first and get those done. Because if you have a portion up top that you can't deliver water through, that means the rest of the system below it can't receive water. So it just makes sense to start at the top, work your way down the system, still get it done, just in a different time frame of the portion of the year, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. I would have to imagine we learned a lot about what it means to run this kind of water in our off season as well. Maintenance schedules aside, what did that look like for putting water through the system during a time when we typically don't?
Yeah, there's a thought that, when we're in this situation where we have these flood flows, that everybody should just open their gate. Just open your gate. There's water in the system, just open it. That doesn't work. It doesn't work that way. It's defined capacity. Our canal system is not infinite in capacity. There's only so much water you can pass through it when it's set up in delivery mode. When I say delivery mode, I'm talking about, again, when we check it up to where it's at high enough levels to be able to push water on the land around it. There's a defined capacity in there that we can deliver in. So we really had to be thoughtful on the timing of when we set the system up for deliveries. We had to make sure that we were past peak flows. Again, we had telemetry in the system. We could see where the flows were. We're looking at the weather forecast. If it starts to look like it's going to tail off and it's coming true, then we could safely start to check the system up and deliver a portion of those flows. If we had reservoirs everywhere in TID, then we could just store those flows locally and then deliver them safely. But in lieu of reservoirs, we have to get past that first flush in order to do so.
So you mentioned that earlier that there are some challenges, even some dangers to moving some of this stormwater through, in that it's very flashy, as you mentioned, and that it comes when it wants to come. We can't manipulate the rainfall as in the same way that we can move water, our typical surface water around. So what does it mean to kind of operate in that flood mode?
So the flood mode is you're just trying to safely convey these storm flows, these dangerous flows, out of the system as quickly as possible. When I'm talking about the system, I'm talking about our canal system. We're surrounded by communities, towns, homes, farms, roadways, and being able to safely get those flows out of those areas for flood control purposes and into the river system. Our first thought is protection of life and property. So we got to get that out first. Once that risk has gone down, where we can safely deliver it, that's when we can change it to where we're doing delivery like you would see in the irrigation season, where we're checking the system up, raising the levels because it's more under control. In the summertime, those flows are set for the most part at the lake. We order those flows. We know when they come down. They're very controlled. But like you said, these flashy flows, these local storm flows don't act like that. They come when they come. There's no stopping it. You just have to get through the big flush and then safely be able to deliver the tail end of that. Also, too, in the wintertime, as anybody who's driven our canal system or had a need to do that, you get a lot of washouts. That's just the nature of runoff. You have a lot of ponding on the canal banks, and then you get these washout situations where it's not safe to check the canal up to a higher level because now you've got water backed up on these washout areas where our bank is actually washed away. And so last year there was so much rainfall all the time that we had a lot of washouts. And so we're not going to deliver water in an area that's not safe to do so.
Sure.
Another thing that came from this for us is it was very evident that our reliance on solar-powered canal automation is problematic in the wintertime. So I mentioned it was a benefit having all the automation we put in place. Well, that also has its own risk because these are solar-powered sites. So anybody that remembers last year, the sun didn't shine for weeks sometimes, and we've only got 3 days of battery backup at these sites. So we were having to keep extra battery packs on hand charged at all times to go out and manually change batteries out on critical sites to make sure that we could see them and operate them safely. So we're working through that. We're trying to figure out a way to mitigate those issues. Our vendor we work with, Rubicon Australia, is aware as well. And they're trying to figure out a way to mitigate that, either with more battery backup or whatever that looks like in the future. So the automation requires it to be automated.
Another one of those trade-offs. Solar powered is great, but when the sun's not shining, that's not as useful.
Correct.
What were some of the challenges that our growers encountered on their side of things?
Well, first of all, it's cold. They're used to irrigating when you need to irrigate. It's nice weather outside. There were some complaints that it is just too cold to be out of here in the middle of the night to do this, but they were troopers and they did it. To be completely honest, the water we delivered last year was water running off of roadways. It was water running off of lands around TID. This isn't the water that you typically see being delivered from the Tuolumne River. And so one of the questions that kept coming up is what is in this water? To be completely honest, it's variable in nature.
Okay.
It is what it is. It's running off of areas that we don't know. So the growers that participated were aware of that. We made them aware that we don't know what the quality is. They signed an agreement stating that. So we weren't trying to hide the ball, and say this water is the same as what you're receiving from the lake. So that was a question. They agreed to go ahead and move ahead anyways, because these are orchards that have been either irrigated predominantly with micro drip or solid set impact sprinklers, right? And so over time, especially after a drought, you get salt buildup in the root zone of those trees because they're not flushing those salts down. That flood irrigation typically will do. And so it's a risk thing on their end. A further operation, it's a decision they had to make that it was worth it. The water quality question, it was worth the risk of flushing those salts out of the root zone that they had built up within the last drought.
Okay.
Another challenge that some of them saw was farming practices in orchards have changed over the last several decades, where there used to be this typical off-season, where they didn't have as much to do in their orchards. Things have changed. They're in their orchards, some of them all year long now. There's maintenance, there's things they're having to do while they're not irrigating or actively growing. And so what these growers saw was they really had to, instead of thinking they had 2 or 3 months to get these things done, they needed to do it in weeks. Whatever they could get it done before the water showed up. So that was a challenge. We had one of the growers that was actively shaking. He had a shaker in the orchard as he was flood irrigating with floodmar water because he was trying to get the mummies, the leftover, crop off the trees. So he was shaking in 1 check feet away from where he was flood irrigating. So that was a challenge. So the takeaway from that is that was good to know, because growers that want to participate in the future, they need to start thinking about those things.
Sure.
You know what? I don't have till, February or March to get these things done. If I want to take part in flood-mar on my orchard or wherever, I need to get these things done earlier so I can participate.
Yeah, that makes sense. What were some of the benefits that our growers might have observed outside of just the opportunity to participate in the recharge?
The biggest thing that I heard from all of them was rodent control, gophers.
Ah.
So again, these are orchards that don't typically flood irrigate. So there's been years where rodents have been able to establish themselves. So they were all extremely happy about these gopher situation.
Okay.
Another benefit, like I mentioned earlier, was getting the salts that have built up over time after drought, getting those salts pushed down below the root zone to have less impact on their trees. Another benefit was the benefit to their cover crops. A lot of these farmers have cover crops growing in between their tree rows, to help. It just helps with the overall health of the orchard. It helps with nitrates. It helps with water infiltrating better. There's a lot of benefits to having cover crops, and it helped those cover crops as well.
Very good.
Also, it helped, in their minds, the growers that use whole orchard recycling, where they when they pull out an orchard and they grind it up and they put it back in the soil, the extra water applied, in their mind, helped to speed up that breakdown process, on their field. So we didn't measure that, but to them, that was a benefit.
So we mentioned earlier that DWR, the Department of Water Resources, was hoping to gain some understanding and some learning from these flood-mar projects. Ultimately, what was that data used for?
So in the end, Sustainable Conservation, the nonprofit that they partnered with, was able to publish what is known as the On-Farm Recharge Methods Manual. This On-Farm Recharge Methods Manual is posted on Sustainable Conservation site. I believe the link to that will be in the show notes for this podcast.
Yep, we can definitely do that. Absolutely. All right. So in addition to the 3 flood-mar locations, we had one other recharge project that took place last winter. Can you tell me about that one?
Yeah, so there is a grower, East Turlock GSA grower, just outside of our boundary, that has an area on his property that was historically a drainage area. It was a low-lying area that the water, local runoff from when it rained really heavy, would go through his ranch and then get discharged just like most stormwater does into our system. So we would receive it. We'd receive that water. So what he did was he took that land with his own equipment at his own expense and built 2 basins, one to capture the runoff coming off his land and another one to take that water once the sediments and everything settled to the ground or settled to the bottom of that first pond, is to then move it to the second pond for recharge purposes, right? So it was kind of a 2-stage thing. It's located directly next to the Highline Canal, the TID's Highline Canal, between Keys Road and Monte Vista, okay? So his request was to see if it would work. He just reached out, said, "Hey, I've built this recharge pond. I want to see how it's going to perform. I've gone through. I've found this area that has what he called sugar sand. He called it sugar sand, which is not the typical geology. When you think about east of TID, you think of the heavier clay soils. You think of hard pan areas that you would think it wouldn't make sense to do recharge. But he found just the right place on his ranch. Had the equipment to do it. The forethought to do it.
Sure.
There was some restricting layers in that area, hard pan, clay, that he removed himself with his own equipment to try to help it recharge better. And so the board agreed to partner with him using Tuolumne River water, right? So this is we're not talking about local runoff. We're talking about using water from the Tuolumne under what we call replenishment water. So in good water years, typically, our board can decide to make water available to east side lands. These are not within West Turlock. These are East Turlock GSA lands that have existing connections. Okay. They've historically received water from us, and this isn't a new thing. This has been going on for many decades. This particular parcel had not received water from us in the past, so this was a one-off, one-year pilot just to see how it would work. So the grower went ahead and installed his own temporary pipeline. He didn't have a connection to the Highline Canal, so he used his own tractor with a PTO-driven lift pump that we allowed him to lift water out of the Highline and put it into that pond to see how it would work. It worked very well. Let me back up. The Floodmar stuff in TID, the water was free of charge to our in-district customers, usually the local runoff. We didn't charge them for the water. This water was charged out at the $50 per acre foot charge that we charge all replenishment parcels. So the water wasn't free.
In the Floodmar projects, that was storm runoff. In this last recharge project, that was actually Tuolumne River water.
Correct. It was Tuolumne River water during the irrigation season. So these other West Turlock Floodmar pilots that were using the local runoff, that was in the wintertime before the water was brought in from Turlock Lake. This was coming from Turlock Lake, right? Or actually Tuolumne River. We were just releasing it down. And so what we found was we didn't know what was going to happen, to be completely honest, again, because of you just think of that area and you think it's just not going to work. He is another one of those forward thinkers where he, well, to be honest, he wanted to bring more value to his ranch. He realizes his situation. He's in East Turlock. They have a groundwater issue. Anything that he can do on his property to help his situation, as far as groundwater is concerned, is just going to add value to his ranch. Right?
Sure.
But he also is a believer in protecting the environment. So, it was beneficial for him on both fronts. It added value to his ranch if it worked. And it also helped the environment, which to him was a win-win. In the end, it worked. We were able to put water nonstop for roughly 47 days straight in that basin. It never stopped taking water. It never slowed down. It just kept taking it. So we were able to put over 170 acre feet into a small 4-acre basin, very small footprint. When you go back and talk about the Floodmar locations using the local water I talked about, that was 67 acres of land, at different times during the weather. This was only 4 acres. Those other sites put in 80 acre feet. This 1 4-acre pond doubled that.
Wow.
So it performed very well up until his tractor blew up.
Oh, no.
So that was a limiting factor. That's why it stopped. But in the end, he proved and we proved that it worked. So his hope is to be able to continue that in the future at some other time. And it proved that recharge even on the east side could happen.
Sure. And like you said, there are benefits to him and his property. But again, to undertake this whole process, to put his time and resources into building this, not knowing if it was going to work or not, was a big leap of faith. So what a great partnership to actually bring to fruition, to test it and have it work.
Correct. Yeah. It proved, at least to us and to him, that it was a good idea. It could work. So hopefully others will see the same value.
Absolutely. All right. So obviously these projects are either in our territory, very near our territory, close to home. Were there similar projects throughout the state that were being conducted by other water agencies, either just outside of Turlock or like I said, anywhere throughout the state?
Yes. So this condition we were in was being experienced statewide. It wasn't just a localized event. This was everywhere up and down the Sacramento and San Joaquin valleys. Ballpark numbers, but last year alone, there were around 90,000 acres in the Central Valley that participated in some kind of recharge efforts using flood flows. So, again, there's a lot of land that, could be used for Floodmar events. So 90,000 acres is not insignificant. That's a pretty big number. And a majority of those acres were in areas that really needed it. Again, we only did 60, a little over 60 acres here. Down there, South Valley, southern San Joaquin Valley, tens of thousands of acres were participating. So, yeah.
Great. And so some of these South Valley subbasins, as you mentioned, are a little bit ahead of where Turlock is with respect to the filing of their groundwater sustainability plan, in that because they were deemed critically overdrafted, they had an earlier deadline to file their plans than Turlock did. So they kind of already knew of the need, had some maybe projects that were included in their plan as far as recharge goes ready to go when these storms hit. Is that fair?
Yeah, and to say that they were ahead would maybe lead people to believe that we're behind. Actually, we're just in a better situation than they are because we're not so overdrafted. We don't see the issues that they see. They have huge issues down south of us of subsidence, which those that don't know what subsidence is, basically it's the ground level that you're standing on dropping because of overpumping. So you pump so much water out of the aquifer that the soil, clay layers that are below the surface, it's almost like a sponge, right, where it loses the water, to help it stay up. So You're squeezing the water, taking the water out of that sponge, it gets narrower and narrower. Well, all the ground above it has no choice but to go down. So it's really impacted other areas of the state in a really bad way, to where canal systems, storm systems, roads, bridges are dropping. And so it's really impacting infrastructure, critical infrastructure, negatively. Here, we haven't had those issues. We don't have subsidence like you see in other parts of the valley. So because they have those situations going on and so many domestic wells going dry, disadvantaged communities out of water, where they're having to supply water to disadvantaged communities. While there are some small pockets of areas needing to have water given to them or trucked to them within TID, it's not to the extent that you see in the South Valley. So because of that, they were required to come into compliance a couple years earlier than us. So it just sped up that clock of needing to comply with SGMA for them. So again, we're not behind. It's just they really had to act quickly.
Sure. Well, and in the same way that, we're seeing benefits in our area, I would imagine the benefits could be even greater in these areas that are already in a much more critical groundwater situation than what we're experiencing. All right, so let's bring it back to TID specific again. So at a recent board meeting, our board approved a resolution to authorize additional recharge projects in the coming year. What are we looking to do? What's that going to look like?
So the thought here is to leverage the district facilities and the private facilities already in place. Like I mentioned, other areas of the state don't have existing facilities, or they removed them. And they would give their left arm to have what our growers and us, what we have in place. So if we have all these facilities in place, why wouldn't we leverage those when there were flood flows available to do so?
Sure.
It just made sense. Other places are spending a ton of money to do recharge. We could do it for much less money.
Okay.
And in the end, money talks, right? So it just made sense to try to do that as much as we could.
And so what do these projects look like? What kind of project types are we talking about?
So one of the project concepts is known as in lieu recharge. And basically what that means, for those that don't know, is using surface water in lieu of groundwater. That's a very powerful form of recharge, because if you're not pulling out of the ground to begin with, you're not creating this deficit. It's just as good as doing direct recharge. You're not having to take out farmland, to build basins. You're still able to farm. You're just using surface water in lieu of. So that's in lieu. Another project type would be we have certain fields that are going through rotation, like an orchard was pulled out. It was time to replant, right? And so we have some ground with existing facilities that just aren't being irrigated. There's no crop. So why would you irrigate? So the thought is to go ahead and make water available when there were flood flows available, pre-flood releases, to these lands and just irrigate.
Makes sense.
It just made sense to use that without having to build basins or impact cropping that was going on actively. We also have another one. We don't have a lot of basins, dedicated basins, like recharge facilities here within our sub-basin. But there is, those are familiar with Turlock, there's what we call Diane Basin. It's a city of Turlock-owned facility. It's connected to one of our canals. So the thought was, when we had flood flows, pre-flood releases available, and the city wasn't using that facility for storm drainage, was to go ahead and leverage that like a recharge basin. just made sense. There's very little cost or time to do it. You just open a gate. I said earlier, it's not as easy as opening a gate. In this case, it's as easy as opening a gate. So why not do it?
Why not?
Yeah, why not do it? Another thought was we have a lot of growers that have put in their own micro head supply basins where they've put in ponds on their property so they could take water from us or even groundwater for that matter, fill their pond and then irrigate with it. So in the wintertime, if they're not using those basins, they're just sitting idle. Why not, if water's available, make water available to them to put in their ponds and just let it perk?
You mentioned earlier that we are lacking some of these storage facilities that we wish we had. So why not capitalize on some of these smaller facilities that growers
Correct.
have?
If they've already got the facilities in place and they're not being used, why not leverage those?
Sure, absolutely. All right. Any particular locations where we're looking to implement some of these projects?
So generally speaking, we're going to be focusing areas north of Harding Road and east of Highway 99. Like I mentioned earlier, there's that Corcoran clay layer, that restrictive layer. Past that really it becomes the negative to do recharge in those areas. Now you're talking about what I mentioned earlier of, basements, root cellars, flushing of toilets, septic systems. So we don't want to do that. We want to put the water to where it has the most benefit. And that is in the areas where it's being impacted most by this cone of depression, this overpumping from the east.
All right.
It won't mean we won't do recharge in those areas to the west. It's just going to be, we're going to do less of it out there because things could change over time. There could be a drought to where the high groundwater we're seeing in the west isn't high groundwater anymore. It's been pumped. We're not getting all the recharge. There's less water available. So maybe then it makes sense coming off a drought to do recharge in those areas. So it just depends. You have to be willing to change with conditions.
Sure. So in large part, it kind of sounds like it's almost on a case-by-case basis where we have to have a willing grower with access to our system. The water levels have to be in the right spot. Does this sound accurate?
Yes. Yeah, it's very dependent on multiple things, like you said. It's probably the biggest driver is the source of the water. So when it's local runoff, you're limited to the area that you have water available because the water comes in so low into our system locally that you're already cutting out a huge portion of the northern and eastern part of our district because there just isn't water there. When pre-flood releases are available from the Tuolumne, well, then it technically opens up the entire system. And it all of West Turlock and even including East Turlock in certain water years would have access to these pre-flood releases from the Tuolumne. So that's a huge decider on where it can happen. Again, we talked about things like the current groundwater elevations, their location in relation to the Corcoran clay, canal outages. We're still going to have projects. We're going to have things going on in the wintertime. It's not going to allow us to convey water, right? So there's a lot of things that come in, but without willing growers, we're not going to deliver any of it, right? So we can have all the water in the world, and if we don't have people willing to participate, then it's just not going to work out. Makes sense. So how are you going to find these growers? So recently we have performed some high-level outreach. We sent mailers out and some emails out to our growers looking for interest. Very basic questions. Would you be willing to participate in recharge activities on your ranch? Would you be willing to use Tuolumne River water? Would you be able to be willing to use local water? Both. So we tried to answer the most basic questions to figure out, okay, where are these interested landowners at? And to be completely honest, once people start seeing water in the system is when our phones start lighting up. People just see it. They see the water in the system. Hey, what's going on here? And they start calling us. And so a lot of it just happens organically when people see water in the system. And then they'll ask what's going on. We'll explain to them. And then they're either going to want to participate or they're not. So we've had, in my opinion, quite a few positive results from that survey. I think we're pushing close to 10,000 acres that have said they'd be willing to participate. A lot of those acres are in this area that won't benefit from recharge, to be completely honest. Okay. But there are some where it would make sense, in that Houston, Denair, Turlock, Balico area. So we're going to be reaching out to people directly that have reached out to us through this survey when water is available. So if you're listening to this, TID will reach out to you when recharge potential comes available in your area where you could benefit. And then we're also, I assume, going to be reaching out through social media and our regular channels, press releases, social media, direct email, with more information on recharge opportunities in the future.
And if there is a grower in our TID territory that has not replied to the survey or has not indicated that they would be interested in participating in a groundwater recharge project, but would like to, is that opportunity still available to them?
Yes. So you can actually email us directly if you're more comfortable with email. Email gwrecharge@tid.org. I think that email address will probably be in the show notes.
Great. Okay. And then what about so our partnership with Sustainable Conservation? Will we continue that partnership going forward?
Yes. So Sustainable Conservation has been contracted again by California DWR on a multi-year contract to partner with 2 irrigation districts to help expand recharge and floodmar efforts in their districts. Specifically, they're tailoring more to outreach, grower education on how recharge could affect their crops or their situation. Sustainable Conservation has a lot of resources at their disposal, whether it be the Almond Board or whether it be researchers, universities, a lot of things at their disposal to help our growers with questions. I work for an irrigation district. I convey water, to people, and they use it as they see fit. They may have questions for me that I can't answer. Sustainable Conservation is there to help with technical assistance, with water quality questions, crop questions. How's this going to affect them? So they're going to be a valuable resource for our growers, in my opinion. And again, this is a multi-year agreement that we've entered into with them. So they're going to be maybe reaching out to some of you listening to maybe even have field days on your places and invite growers or your neighbors or you to go look at other people that are participating to get real life examples of what they're seeing on their farms when they do recharge. Yeah, absolutely. And the more of these projects we can get going, the more data we have to learn from, which, only helps us kind of better understand the efficacy of these programs, some of the potential drawbacks, how to alleviate some of those drawbacks, maybe. Like I said before, we'll reach out to growers directly that can receive water or recharge water from us. So please don't, if you're out there, please don't just open your gate. If you see water in the canal, don't just open your gate and take it. It still needs to be coordinated with us. We still need to be able to deliver it. We need to be able to account for it. So yeah, please, we'll reach out to you. I think it's a point worth repeating, that just because the water's there doesn't mean it's available for the taking. But we would be interested to know that they would be interested in participating. So again, don't hesitate to reach out. One thing I think I forgot to mention was our board, the TID board, approved that water will be free of charge, to our growers. So if we reach out to you, you're a West Turlock grower. Typically, when I say West Turlock, I'm talking about people that receive water from us during the irrigation season. Okay. So if we reach out to you with this recharge opportunity, the water currently is set at 0 charge. So you would not be charged for that water. It would be free to you. If you're an East Turlock GSA grower, that water will be charged out to you at the current rate of $50 an acre foot until it changes otherwise. So as of today with this podcast, it's $0 for West Turlock growers, $50 an acre foot for East Turlock growers. That is if you are participating in one of these floodmar projects. Correct. Very good. Okay. Wes, anything else that we haven't touched on that we need to mention with regard to TID's groundwater recharge efforts? I'm sure there's something. But we've covered a lot already. So just looking forward to it. It's going to be a lot of work. Heading down a path that we haven't headed down before. So it'll be interesting to see how it pans out. So just looking forward to it. Absolutely. Great. Well, we appreciate you being here today to share what you know so far. And we look forward to having you back sometime in the future to tell us what else you've learned on these processes. All right. Thank you. Awesome. Thank you. Thank you for tuning in to the TID Water and Power Podcast.
You can find TID on Facebook at facebook.com/TurlockID, on Instagram and Twitter at TurlockID, and on LinkedIn as the Turlock Irrigation District. I'm your host, Constance Anderson. We'll see you again next time.